Hey, what's going on? So, back when I was a kid, one of my favorite games to play was Gauntlet 2. I can recall spending hundreds of dollars worth of quarters down at the recreation center by the base. My dad would drop me off, and I would just plunk quarter after quarter playing Gauntlet 2. Gauntlet 1, I was not so fond of. I actually had a trauma related to that game, which I'll talk about one day. But today, I'm going to talk about this. I believe it is time for a new Gauntlet game. The last Gauntlet that we had was 2014 and the Slayer Edition update. And it's been like 10 years. It's time for another one, especially now that we've seen the success of games like Diablo 4. Baldur's Gate 3 just won a ton of awards, including Game of the Year. And I think that now is about the time, the right time, to see a Gauntlet make a comeback. The most recent one was actually a really good game, but I think it's time to do more because Gauntlet 2014 was not a triple A game. It was kind of just a downloadable, hey, here's a new Gauntlet sort of deal. But I think that if you put the triple A time and effort into it, it could actually be something special. But in order to really understand why there should be a new Gauntlet game, let's talk about some of the old ones and what actually made Gauntlet great to begin with. For one, it was one of the few at its time, the few four-player simultaneous arcade games. I mean, this is at a time before Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, The Simpsons, and all of those games came out. This was Gauntlet and Gauntlet 2 were already there with the four-player play. And back in the arcade days, I mean, that was a lot of fun. I mean, a lot of people nowadays won't understand that you could actually have four people on the same game cabinet, four complete strangers, shoulder to shoulder, actually touching each other, and no one thought it was a big deal. It was perfectly fine. I mean, those were some of the greatest times. You could play cooperatively with each other, or you could play competitively. I mean, you could work together to try to get through the dungeons, or you could compete against each other. You could steal food from each other or destroy the food and piss off your teammates or your adversaries, depending on how you felt about them. And you could do this for hours and hours and spend tons of money. Now, the original Gauntlet only had I said only had 100 levels. I mean, I don't think very many people actually made it all the way through the whole game, especially because it starts getting really, really hard after level 7. And then when Gauntlet 2 came out, it was just endless. Gauntlet 2 actually didn't have an ending to it. You would get through the levels and then it would start to regenerate some of those same levels, but they'd turn it at different angles and they'd switch it up one way or another. But the game was actually endless. Now, the beauty of Gauntlet in the arcade was that there was always people playing. I mean, you could always get a full squad to play the game together, and Gauntlet was meant to be played with other people. Like, that is always going to be the best way to play Gauntlet. So when the home versions came out, the NES version, and I believe there might have been one on Sega as well, they didn't do as well on the home systems because, let's face it, when you're at home, it's just you playing the game and it takes a lot of the fun out of it. I mean, yeah, you could get some of your friends over and you guys could play together, but even then, this is a dungeon crawl game. It's not going to be everybody's cup of tea. And you're probably going to want to play other games like Mario Brothers or something like that. So I feel like that's part of the reason why Gauntlet didn't do as well on the home systems as it did in the arcades, because that's really where Gauntlet belongs. And nowadays, there's been a resurgence too of retro gaming in particular, and the arcades have come back. Where I live, we have a couple of places where they have arcades of the 80s and some from the 90s, and you can go over there. You pay 10, 12 bucks to get in, and you can just play the games for free all day. So I think that nostalgia is coming back, and a lot of these older games can make a comeback. I know that Pac-Man has definitely been working on it, but Gauntlet definitely needs a new treatment these days. And obviously, there was Gauntlet 1 and Gauntlet 2, the originals, and then there was the Gauntlet Legends era, which started with Gauntlet Legends, Gauntlet Dark Legacy and Gauntlet Seven Sorrows. I put Seven Sorrows in that same bracket because even though Seven Sorrows was a newer game, it still kind of falls in line with that era of Gauntlet. And then after that, you have the 2014 Gauntlet and Slayer Edition, the modern era of Gauntlet. Now, Gauntlet Legends was a lot different from Gauntlet 1 and 2 because of the perspective, and the graphics had improved a lot since then. There was a lot more emphasis on 3D graphics at the time. And even though it was a lot different from Gauntlet 1 and 2, it was still a lot of fun to play in its own way. And believe it or not, if you are a fan of the Gauntlet games, there were actually 3 other Gauntlets between Gauntlet 2 and Gauntlet Legends. And I would completely forgive you if you didn't know that because they were all 3 really failed games. 2 of them were exclusive to failed Atari consoles, the Jaguar and Lynx. There was a Gauntlet 3 and Gauntlet the Third Encounter. And then there was Gauntlet 4, which was exclusive to the Sega Genesis. But that came out at a time when I believe the Genesis was getting close to the end of its console cycle, and it was already in competition with Super Nintendo. And I believe that the PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and 32X were all right around the corner. So Gauntlet 4 didn't really get noticed that much, and the 2 versions of Gauntlet 3 didn't get noticed at all, again, because they were on Atari systems that literally nobody bought. But the big problem for all of the home Gauntlet systems, home Gauntlet versions, if you ask me, is that there is a lack of 4-person play. I mean, some of them were capable of being played with 4 people, but you'd have to buy an adapter, you'd have to get all this extra stuff. And really, Gauntlet and maybe 1 or 2 other games were the only ones that would even support 4 players at the time. So there was no real reason to ever actually go out and spend the money on that. And then again, you still have to have 3 other friends that are going to want to play Gauntlet with you for hours. All the rest of the time, you're going to be sitting there playing the game by yourself. Anyways, that's one of the reasons why the home systems didn't do so well. But Gauntlet itself is a lot of fun. One of the biggest things that I remember, the defining element of Gauntlet was the sense of dread that a player would feel whenever you got to a locked door and you could see the monster generators behind the door. You have to go through that door to get to the exit, but you can't find the key. And you're going around, you're searching and searching for the key. And when you get back to that door, there's going to be hundreds of ghosts and demons sitting there waiting for you because those generators have just been constantly churning out new enemies. And you finally get in and you have to fight through all of them. And maybe you get to the generators and destroy them and you get to the exit alive. I mean, that's peak Gauntlet when you're running through gangs and gangs of enemies to get to the exit. And when the Gauntlet Legends era started with Legends, Dark Legacy, and Seven Sorrows, there was a lot less of that. And I think a lot of that is because of the way the games were set up. The emphasis was on graphics, so you had a closer camera to your characters, so you could actually see their detail. And because of that, and because of the hardware limitations, even at that time, because all of the enemies are a lot more detailed, you really couldn't have as many enemies on the screen at the same time that you could have back in the 8-bit and 16-bit era. And that took away from the second generation of games being true Gauntlet games, but they were still good games, I think. And for a new Gauntlet game, the way I believe Gauntlet 2014, well, Gauntlet 2014 was actually more a throwback to Gauntlet and Gauntlet 2 because they went back to that high overhead camera. They went back to fighting hordes and hordes of enemies, and it was really just going back to the classics. It was a reimagining of classic Gauntlet that kind of put the Legends era aside a little bit. Now, I would propose that when a new Gauntlet does come out, the way that 2014 was a throwback to Gauntlet 1 and 2, I think that the next one should be more of a throwback to the Legends era, to Gauntlet Legends, Gauntlet Dark Legacy, and Gauntlet Seven Sorrows, and that we should have more of the close-up cameras, the more adventurous outdoor perspective of those games versus the first two. Now, at the same time, the drawback, in my opinion, of the Legends era is that you didn't have those instances where you're just fighting hundreds of characters at the same time, and a lot of that is because of the close camera angle. And even though today's systems are capable of doing way more than what was done back in the PlayStation, Nintendo 64 era, that close camera would hurt in situations and keep you from really, really being able to have that massive horde of enemies coming at you all at once. So what I would propose would be a little bit of a mix between the two. Like maybe you have an overworld that plays a little bit more like Skyrim, a little bit more like Dark Legacy, where you have your characters in detail, you can see everything, and then you can go to dungeons. And when you go to the dungeons, castles, or indoor areas, the camera changes and it goes back to the classic Gauntlet 1, Gauntlet 2 look. So that way you have the best of both worlds. Because one of the things that I think was a negative of Gauntlet 2014 was, even though it was closer to the original Gauntlet, you have all of these updates in graphics. You have all of the resolution, but the camera is so far away that you don't really get to see it that often. Like, it doesn't matter how you customize your warrior or Valkyrie if the camera is always going to be so far away that basically you're just following that blue or red circle around them to even know where your character is at all times. So I would totally say that I would want a little bit of both. I would want some of the closer, more detailed look from Gauntlet Legends, Gauntlet Dark Legacy, and Gauntlet Seven Sorrows particularly. But I would still want areas of the game where we go back to that top-down look from the classics Gauntlet and Gauntlet 2. And to touch on Seven Sorrows a little bit, that was a very, very underrated game. It's one of the few Gauntlet games, much like the Gauntlet 3 and Gauntlet 4, which no one ever heard of. Seven Sorrows was never released in the arcade. It was a console exclusive. And the drawback of that is that Seven Sorrows, Gauntlet was meant to be played with friends. And even though Seven Sorrows came out at a time when online play was around, it was still kind of in its infancy. So it was really hard to get a squad together to play Seven Sorrows. So even with that game, you were mostly playing by yourself, and that really took a lot of the Gauntlet experience out of it. But today, I think with today's matchmaking and today's consoles, you can get into a game fairly easily now. Even in Gauntlet being 10 years old, I can jump on the Gauntlet 2014 and I can find other people that are still playing the game. So I think a new Gauntlet game, especially with a lot of the more modern elements and something that brings back the Legends Dark Legacy era as well, I think that would do pretty well, especially if you give it even half the treatment that they gave Baldur's Gate 3 and Diablo 4. I think the thing that would help too is that you keep Gauntlet simple. It's not an RPG. It's a dungeon crawler. I would like upgrading characters a little bit. I would like to, do cosmetic things with your characters, maybe even upgrade your weapons and armor a little bit. But I would not want the game itself to revolve around those elements. I think Gauntlet should just be a game where you and your friends get together and you just you're running around, slice up bad guys. And then you bring back the competitive elements as well, like the It monster was a big thing in Gauntlet 2, where if it touched you, you became it. All of the monsters came after you and left everyone else alone until you touched one of the other players. And I think things like that really added to the experience, and they've kind of been lost in recent games. Well, they've been lost in all of the recent Gauntlet games. But number one, and most of all, it's got to be a game that you can play with your friends, because that's what Gauntlet is. That's what Gauntlet has always been. And you've got to have that element of dealing with lots of enemies at the same time. And you got to have variety. That's something that was kind of missing in Gauntlet 2014, is that the game got a little bit repetitive. And yeah, a little bit of that is what Gauntlet is and what Gauntlet has always been. But at the same time, you do have to update it just a little bit. You do have to add to it. But anyways, those are my thoughts. I think it's definitely time for a new Gauntlet, and hopefully within the next couple of years we'll see that. Hopefully someone will hear this and realize that, you know what, it is time for a new Gauntlet, and we'll be the ones to do it. So till next time, I will be seeing ya.
Have you heard of the Kumite?
Did you say Kumite?
Uh-huh, the Kumite.